Yes, Sunny, would that be comfortable for you? Do you prefer like a questions and answers kind of conversation? How do you feel more
Yeah,
comfortable?
yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just more conversational that way, you know? So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
that'd be
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I think that m many of the people are on vacation,
that's
fortunately,
okay.
now in the summer.
That's
But
okay.
we will send the recording later on. So thank you so much. Also, I'm sorry that we were a little bit late, but we will stick to 7 p.m. so you can go
Oh,
on your
no
other
worries.
tasks for the day.
Okay.
Okay. So then, Sasha, if you want, let's start, right? I mean, I think
Um,
everyone, people
we
may
can
join
start.
later
Yes, we
on.
can start.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
can start.
Okay. Okay. Then, yes, I am going to repeat, Sasha, but if it's possible, for you to just share a little bit about yourself and the Independent Podcast Network to begin with.
Okay. Well, oh, do we start now? I wasn't sure if you were going to intro or do anything. Go ahead and
That's
start.
uh, that's all. Yes,
Okay.
you can
Okay.
start whenever. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you guys for inviting me to speak here and share something that I'm really passionate about, which is podcasting. My name is Sunny Gault, and I have been podcasting for about 17 or 18 years, which sounds kind of crazy because a lot of people don't even know podcasting was around that long ago.
Wow.
I know, right? It's been a while. I've seen a lot of things happen, and I'm sure a lot of that's going to come up in the course of our conversation today. But my background, I went to college and I studied journalism. Okay. And what that taught me is when you work in those small television markets and sometimes radio, I did a lot of interning in radio, you learn how to pretty much do everything yourself, right? You don't have big teams of people to help you. And you learn the equipment really well because you have to know how this equipment works, whether it's working right or you're out on a story and it's not working so well. So for me, it was a really good lead into podcasting because as a podcaster, there's so much that unfortunately you kind of have to deal with on your own unless you're part of a big team. But most of us are starting out smaller and we're kind of learning and growing and doing all that kind of stuff. So I feel really fortunate to have brought the radio and TV experience with me. I feel like it was a really good kind of springboard, if you will, a really good way to prepare me for everything in podcasting. So I worked in radio and TV and worked at television stations, multiple TV stations here in the US. And then got to a point in my life where I wanted to try something a little different. My life was changing a little bit. I was now married. I wanted to start a family. And the TV radio life really wasn't conducive to the family life I wanted to have. So at the same time is when podcasting really started to make a name for itself. Originally, it's gone through stages, of course. We're talking still a long, long time ago, but there were early adopters getting into podcasting. And usually these were like the people that would have done the ham radio. You guys have heard of ham radio, people trying to make radio stuff work in their garage and whatever. And so I was really intrigued by this. I love the idea of being able to create whatever content you wanted to, because when you are used to creating content for radio and television, sometimes there are restrictions, right? The content has to, fit some sort of parameters, right? Or it has to appeal to a certain type of group, or at least enough people that they can sell advertising toward or whatever. So there's always some stipulations and some rules. And I felt like podcasts it's kind of what we call like the Wild West. It was just, it was free. It was, you could really do anything you wanted to do. And so I did. I found a lot of independence and freedom in being able to do that. And one of the things I got some advice from people that were already podcasting. It's the first thing I did, because again, I have a journalism background. So I interview people and I talk to people and I figure out, okay, well, how, what is your experience podcasting and what would you do differently? And I talked to some people like that who had already been doing it for just a little bit of time, maybe 6 months or so, and learned from them and tried to, not make some of those, early on mistakes. But I still made, plenty of mistakes. It was still in the, very early stages. Back then, I think the biggest hiccup back then was technology. We didn't have all of the tools. I mean, there's so many podcasting tools out, nowadays, everything from podcast hosting to recording your podcast online to podcast editing tools. Now you can edit with just text, like through programs like Descript. We didn't have any of that kind of stuff back then. So I literally went out and got a book. Believe it or not, there was a book on podcasting even when I started. And I figured out what equipment I had at the time, which wasn't a lot because at this point I graduated, college. I had, worked in some TV markets and, I had like a camera. It wasn't even, I don't even know if it was a digital camera. I think it was some sort of camera. I had to somehow create a digital signal from it. There was all this stuff that I had to figure out. Nothing was easy. But I'm looking at my book here and I'm learning what an RSS feed is. And I'm like, okay, and now I've got this camera that I'm plugging into my laptop and trying to get a picture. And I started just playing around with the medium. Like I really didn't know what to expect and neither did anybody else. But I knew how to create content, right? I had the background of producing stories and reporting on stories for the news. And so I knew what made a good story. And I thought, well, this is just another medium to be able to express myself through. We just got to figure out the medium. So I started by doing a daily show, again, just playing around, just trying to figure out what all this stuff was. There were video sharing sites out there. YouTube was one of them, but there were other ones, believe it or not. Most people don't realize this. There were other video sharing sites before YouTube. YouTube kind of took over. Obviously, they're huge now. They weren't in the beginning. In the beginning, I could email, Joe from YouTube and he would respond immediately back to me. It was a totally different space. But I created a show, a daily show where I reported on things that were happening online. So just kind of funny headlines. I basically took what I knew about the news and I thought, well, I know this kind of format. Let's just have some fun with it. Everyone says the internet is this crazy place. So let's report and have fun on the crazy things people are doing. That will be my show. I didn't really expect it to go anywhere. But again, it was me testing things out and not really knowing where it was going to go. But I did that for probably 3 or 4 months. So I think it was 5 days a week. So Monday through Friday, I released I don't even remember how long it was, 10 minutes or less, little newscast about stuff that was happening online. And one of the video sharing sites that I was uploading my content to reached out to me. It wasn't YouTube. It was another one. It was called VEOH.com. And they happened to be in the same city I lived in. And I didn't even know, honestly. And they said, hey, we see you're posting this content. Would you be interested in coming in and talking to our engineers and just letting us know what you like about the product, what you wish was different, just feedback? And I said, okay, sure, I'll come in. And so I did that. I went down, I'm in Southern California, and so in the San Diego area. So I went to their office in San Diego and I met with engineers. I met with their marketing team. I spent, several hours just talking to them about their product and what I liked about it and things features I wish they had that they didn't have. And at the end of the conversation, I said, I might be able to really help you guys. What are you guys trying to do? And they're like, well, we're trying to get more people to, upload videos to our platform. And I said, well, I produce shows. I said, what if we created a show about people that were creating content for the platform and how they were doing it? And we featured it, on, your website. And it would be like episodic content and we feature different people. Well, long story short, I created a job for myself at the company. And for a couple of years, that's what I did. We had a show, it was called Viral, VIRAL. And it went out and it interviewed people. I mean, San Diego's close to LA, right? So in the beginning, there was a lot of budding, like people from LA that was trying to get in on video podcasting. And because their stuff wasn't getting picked up elsewhere. So they're like, well, let's put our stuff online, right? And so I would go up, I had a team of, group of like a videographer and producer and stuff with me. And we would travel to LA a lot, maybe a couple times a week and we would shoot content, and we would also have people send us stuff because there were people we couldn't get to, but sometimes we would travel. Like we made a trip to New York City at one time to interview people over there. But for the most part, it was either people were in the LA or Southern California area, or they were sending us content that we would put together. Because again, they're creating their own shows. So it's not that, difficult for them to shoot behind the scenes footage for us and stuff like that. And then we just edited it and put it up, put it on the show. And that worked really, really well. Like I said, I did that for 2 years. We won a couple Webby Awards in the beginning. That was new at the time too. Webby Awards were new. But it was great. It was a lot of fun. And that was my kind of intro into this space. Now, a lot of the content we were doing then was video based, but we would also convert the podcasts, if you will, because they were video podcasts, but we would convert them into audio as well. And so that was kind of, like I said, my first couple shows or whatever into podcasting. And then from there, I started producing other content for other people. From there, it was interesting because the industry started to change a little bit. We didn't have as many video podcasts. Once YouTube really started to take off, that became the hub for putting your video content there, as opposed to using an RSS feed, which is how I really, distinguish, okay, what is a podcast, as opposed to just episodic content on YouTube. One way I describe it is that, well, it has to have an RSS feed that's tied to it. You have to be able to distribute it that way. And so it's a very technical term, but that's kind of how I define the difference between the two. And so you had people doing video stuff, but the files were too big. Again, this is all technology based, right? We didn't have the ability to really compress files the same way that we can do that kind of stuff now and distribute it via RSS. So what we saw was a lot of people just going towards YouTube that wanted to do video. And then if you were just doing audio, then you would do a podcast. Okay. So we had both in the beginning, then it became, the video went this way. And then podcasting became known mainly for audio. And now we're in a position where video's coming back because you can do that now, because like I said, the tools are available, and you see a lot of podcast host providers now providing video and audio options, but we didn't have that for many, many years. So it's like I said, the industry is just, it's constantly changing. And so, you just kind of change with it. So for me, like I said, a lot of the content in the beginning was video based. And then I got to a point where, in my own life, I was like, well, I've been producing content for other people. Maybe it's time for me to go out on my own, create my own company. I felt very comfortable with podcasting at that point. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I could do this on my own. And that happened at a stage of life for me that was pretty important. So my husband and I wanted to have a family, and I really didn't know anything about raising kids, like pretty much nothing about raising kids and that whole process. And so I thought, well, again, I've got a journalism background. I know how to interview people. So why don't I do shows about pregnancy and parenting and I will learn as the audience learns. I'll create this great content. I'll help myself and I'll help other people out there. And that's what I did. I mean, I started with 3 podcasts that were focused. I had a pregnancy show. I had a show about breastfeeding and pumping. And I had a show for parents that had like infants and toddlers. Okay. So that's what I started with. And I ended up adding 2 more shows because that's what happens. You start podcasting and you can't stop and you become this serial podcaster. And so, and I ended up creating a business out of it. And I learned a lot through that. I didn't do everything myself, by the way. I thought it'd be really boring if I were the host of all the shows. Like, who wants to listen to anybody? I don't care how much you like a host. Who wants to listen to somebody do 5 different shows? So what I did, and a lot of this was just trial and error. I really didn't know what I was doing. Again, I had the background, my journalism background to help me, and I'd worked on other shows, but, it's not a lot to learn. So what I did, because these shows were more focused on parents, I would just bring in regular parents and kind of test them out on the show. And if they were good at asking questions and interviewing people and if they had a good personality and were willing to share their parenting stories and just seemed very natural, then eventually they ended up as a host on the show, and it just kind of grew organically from there. Like I said, I ended up with 5 shows. And after a couple years, we were at a point where, and the industry was at a point too. So we're talking about maybe, let's see, those shows launched in 2012. And it was at least a couple years after that, we got our first sponsor. So you're talking about 2014, maybe even into 2015, because it was still very new. I was going to these events, these parenting, these big parenting conferences and expos and stuff like that. We got a lot of those in the US. And so I would go to these events and I would have like my demo with me for the shows and stuff. And I would talk to these people and I would hand out these. At the time they were, I think, DVDs or something. There's much better ways to pass out stuff at conferences now. But that's what I did. I mean, it was a lot of hustle. And a lot of people are like, what's a podcast? I don't know what a podcast is. And then so you had to kind of explain what a podcast was. And I kind of got lumped into the blogger category for a very long time, the mommy bloggers. I'm like, I'm not really a blogger, but okay, I guess I fall into this space now. And like I said, I started to get some sponsors, just for one episode. It started very small, but the first time I got a sponsor, I think it was a $500 sponsorship. It was a quick little interview that I did with them in an episode. And I can't tell you how happy I was. I was over the moon happy. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're finally not making a lot of money, but something. It was like a start. Like sometimes that's all you need is something that just, keeps you going and keeps you moving forward. And so, that's the story of how we got our first sponsor. And it became a little bit easier after that. And I can certainly go into more about monetization and the stuff that I learned. But I continue to do those shows. In fact, those shows are still around today. And we are still producing content for those 5 pregnancy parenting shows that I launched everything with. Other people host them and take care of them. And I manage most of it now. But I was in the weeds for a very, very long time. I mean, we were releasing 5 episodes a week. So ended up with 5 podcasts, and it was a weekly show for each of those podcasts. So that's 5 episodes a week. New episodes, new guests, like it was a lot. And the format of those shows was very different. I still don't see a lot of shows that are formatted this way, but it was more of a roundtable discussion. So it wasn't just the host asking the expert a question. That would have been easy. Okay. I had maybe an expert, but then I had other parents, just picture, yourself chatting with people around a round table, right? And so they were participating in the conversation. And what was really nice about that format is that it brought a lot of realism, if you will, or like it just felt really, really real. Like you can have an expert tell you something, but then you need the practical side of it. Like, okay, that's great. And that's what you would find in a textbook, but that doesn't always work in real life. Right. And so we had these really interesting parenting conversations about, okay, what do you do when your child does this? Well, you say that, but I don't know if that's really going to work in my house. But that kind of style, I think people learned really well, and still do today when they listen to that content because, they're just getting a lot of different perspectives. But that was just a style that I thought would work best. Every podcast is a little different, but it was a lot to put those episodes together. And long story short, I was working on those shows for a while, and then I would meet other podcasters and they were like, hey, can we be part of your network? And at the time, I never really thought of it as a network. I was producing content that happened to, have a similar, demographic or genre to it, right? Parents. But I didn't really think of it as a network. And I thought, actually, this really is a network. I'm not calling it a network or anything, but it is a network. Again, pulling from my radio and TV days, it's a group of shows and we're cross promoting each other and helping each other out that way. And we're all growing as a result. So I guess that is a network. So I was approached by a couple podcasts to join our network. And I was like, we don't have a network. But then the more I thought about it, I'm like, yeah, I think this might be a network, but I didn't want to just add it to what I was already doing. So that led to me launching my first podcast network. which was called Parents on Demand. And I literally, I could tell you more about that, but it was just parenting shows. So what I ended up doing is taking my 5 shows and outreaching to other podcasters that were producing parenting content to see if they wanted to join the network. It was just a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, honestly. A lot of conversations. What are you guys looking for in a network? Maybe we can be that. Let's talk, because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was making it up as I went, but I thought, well, what's the best way to do this? Let's see what podcasters are looking for out there. And let's see if we can all come together as a network. How can we be stronger together? So it started with Parents on Demand. And then I had more and more people. I would meet people, whether I was at conferences or whatever. And I would tell them what I was doing. And they were like, can we join your network? I'm like, you're not a parenting show. You can't join my network. And then I was like, oh, I guess I got to open this up more. Like, why am I turning people away? They've got good content. So it was just a very organic way of creating a network. It was just, I just went where it was leading me to go. I didn't really try to push it too much. And that's how Independent Podcast Network came about. It was originally a show, or not a show, a network called Parents on Demand. And then other people wanted to join. And I'm like, I got to change the name. And so it became Independent Podcast Network. That was a few years ago that change happened. And we've been through different iterations ever since. And I can go on and on about all that, but I'm sure you guys have questions. But in a nutshell, that is how my podcasting career evolved.
I have this question regarding, because as I mentioned to you and to your colleague during the emails that we exchanged, we're also trying to create something like a network, or more like a space where we can exchange resources. So I've just been wondering, especially when you mentioned that you decided to widen like your range and to accept people with like different topics. Is it how do you manage that, and especially for the audience as well? Because I imagine that they know this brand, that is the Independent Podcast Network, but also they have all with these individual moments with different topics and guests, and as you said, formats that are quite differently set. So I've just been wondering how do you first manage that, but also and curate it, maybe I would say. And the other aspect for me is how do you communicate to the audience, whether it's like a whole or maybe more like separate channels that they can jump in when they're interested. So yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you kind of create this network, and how do you curate it, right? So everybody, okay, I don't think there is a one size fits all when it comes to how do you do a podcast network. In addition to the stuff I do with Independent Podcast Network, I also run a mastermind group for people who do have small to medium-sized networks. And we get together once a month on Zoom, and we talk to each other, and we talk about what our networks are going through. So I have personal experience with hearing what other networks are going through. And it's so funny because even we're all going through something a little bit different. We all structure our networks a little bit different. I'll tell you what I did for Independent Podcast Network. In starting it, again, I had all these parenting type shows because it was, it came from a parenting network. And I knew that sales were going to become important in this, right? We needed to be able to make money. And my experience in working with sales teams is that usually they wanted to focus on a certain type of like category or genre, as opposed to having podcasts and, all different types of genres. Because when you're outreaching, for advertising, that's just more advertisers you have to outreach to. If you can stay, in a vertical, they call them, right? So in our case, it was more of a pregnancy parenting vertical for most of our shows, that it was easier. So as far as who I outreached to, even though I had expanded, to now it's Independent Podcast Network, I still did a lot of outreach to the pregnancy and parenting community because I was trying to strengthen that vertical. So the sales team, people that we were working with, could, when they found an advertiser, not only, it just made sense to build up those shows so that we can make more money, when they did find an advertiser. So not only is the advertiser advertising, let's say you start with 3 shows, but then you add a couple more. So now the advertiser can advertise on 5 shows and you make more money. So that was part of it, is really thinking about it from a sales point of view. because I knew we had to make money in order to survive. And we also, the way that we have our network structured is that my goal is to help the podcasters that we're working with make money too. So, Independent Podcast Network, we do have the shows that I started with that I told you guys about. But for the most part, we focus on partnering with podcasts already in existence and help them. If their strategy is monetization and they want to improve their show, we come alongside those shows and we work alongside them. So we don't do a lot of internal creation. Like I said, my shows came along because it's my network, but for the most part, we don't necessarily start shows from scratch. But in outreach, there were certain things that I was looking for. I was looking for, not only do you need to fall into this category or this vertical of pregnancy and parenting, you had to be regularly producing content, because that's a frustrating thing too, that we're trying to resolve. But, people get excited about podcasting and then they're not really sure how the whole thing works. And they start producing their episodes and they do what we call pod fade, which means, I don't need to do it every week. I'll do it every 2 weeks. And then it's every month. And then it's every 6 months. And then you never hear from them again. Right. We call it pod fading. And that's not what we want. We want people to stay committed. But in order to do that, they have to see a progress. They have to see that, their whatever their podcasting goals are, that they're able to do that. So that was another criteria. So we were looking to see how often they were releasing content. Do they have a history of being able to release content on a regular basis? Because that's one of the things too, when you're building a podcast audience, it's consistency. The audience wants to know that you're going, if you've got a weekly show, you need to commit to that weekly show. They need to know that when they show up, you're going to be there. And that's what's going to help build your audience. And yes, it's true. People can subscribe to your show, and then whenever they, listen to a certain app, it'll show you new episodes. But this is more of a relationship that you have with your audience, right? And if you want them to really be excited about show, especially if you're trying to build community, you need to do whatever you're going to do, whether it's every 2 weeks or every week or daily. I don't really recommend that. I haven't seen a lot of good return on investment in that. I've tested it out personally. Whatever you're going to do, stick to it. And if you do need to make a change, it's okay, because life happens, but let your audience know what's going on. So if you start out weekly and then you need to drop down to every 2 weeks, that's okay, because, they'll understand. We're human. We get it. Okay. But just let them know, hey guys, we're going to drop down to, twice a month or, every other week, whatever the case may be. We're still going to give you the same great content, all that stuff. Right. So that was another factor, was making sure that they release content on a regular basis. A lot of it, though, was just wanting to make sure, the content needed to be good, but it didn't need to be perfect, because again, we're all about partnering with them and helping them. I just needed to see that spark in them. Like, they were willing to listen. They were willing to take notes. They were willing to change and evolve. And they weren't one of those people that thought they had everything figured out and would never listen to any outside criticism or advice, because there's a lot of different ways you can structure a podcast, but there are some no-nos and stuff that you probably shouldn't do or probably should try to avoid. I've worked with podcasts that, you tell them over and over again, they want to grow their show, and you tell them, this is really what you need. I listened to your show. This is what I recommend. And they never change. So we were trying to avoid those types of podcasts, right? We really wanted people that, don't have to change everything. We didn't do anything like that, but it was like, okay, if we said, listen, your artwork, your podcast artwork, like, I don't even know what your show is about by looking at your artwork. I always tell people, I'm like, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but we do that every single day when we're looking at podcasts. We are looking at someone's artwork to determine if we want to click play. That is like your biggest marketing tool that you have, is your artwork. And I would tell people, if you're not a graphic designer, don't do it yourself. You can get artwork done for $50, $100, or probably even less. Like, have someone do it. Why are you going through all this effort of creating these episodes and stuff if no one's even going to click on your content? Right. So that's just one example of offering some feedback. And we wanted people to be able to take that and be serious about it, because our success was based on their success, right? So if their show isn't growing and they're not able to make money through advertising, so we weren't profiting either, because we were doing an ad revenue share with them. Yeah. So those were some of the things that we looked for, in podcasts. There were times that we brought people on board and it didn't work out. We always had contracts and stuff, but we always let people out. It wasn't like you have to stay in this contract for X amount of time. It was, okay, this contract is for 6 months, but if you need to get out before that, we need 30 days notice or 60 days notice or whatever it was. Because, a lot of times, there was still a lot of education going on about what we were doing, what is a network, how can we help you? And then, the podcaster, and there's just a lot of variables. So that's something I learned too, that it's important. You don't really want to lock people into stuff, if it's not a good fit.
Okay, may I ask you, because you started speaking about artwork.
Yes.
What is, in your opinion, the most, these most important elements in a cover for audio episode or for a video? Your understanding about it, because people are just paying too much attention on if it's video just to put a picture on it, or let's say to make the title really big one, or what to do. Your opinion.
No, that's a great question. I would say that less is more with your podcast artwork. Okay. So Apple does have restrictions on what you can and can't do. So that's usually the first place I tell people go to, and I could give you guys that link if you don't already have it, but it will go through, because Apple is kind of, they've been the leader in this, because that's where podcasting started, right? And so with iPods, it was, you listen to your podcast on your iPod. And so they still kind of set the rules, really, because it's still the biggest platform out there. And so they've got their list of rules. So they'll say, not too much text and not above this, size from the bottom or the sides, you got to do all that kind of stuff. In general, this is what I do. You mentioned images. So if your podcast, I think this depends on what type of show you have. If you have a podcast where you are the expert, right? You are giving tips and tricks and whatever, and it really focuses around your brand and who you are, then I do think that having a professional image of yourself is important to have on there. I would also recommend having your name somewhere on there, like hosted by or by whatever, your name is. But if that's not the case, then don't feel like you have to have your image up there, because one thing, and I will tell you what I did with my parenting shows that worked really, really well. I hired, what would you call them? Someone that specialized in animation and like cartoons and things like that to create my artwork. So they're very, cartoony. They're different parents, and sometimes they're holding babies and sometimes they're holding kids. And I hired them to do the artwork, and I just said, I want the person to kind of look like this, and they're holding this and whatever. And so she did the basis for it. And then I had a graphic designer take that and create the rest of the artwork for it. But I have gotten so many comments on those little characters, which I own the rights to, because, I had someone create it, and then, I paid for it. So I have the rights to it. I've been able to use that in a lot of different ways. And the other thing I did too, is I worked with really bright colors. So I've got like a bright red, I've got a bright orange, I have a bright green, a bright purple, and a bright blue. Because, and this is a good test to see if your podcast artwork really stands out. What I do is I go on the computer, I open up Apple or whatever podcasting app where you just kind of see the screenshots for the podcast, the thumbnails or the artwork essentially. And I'll go in there and I'll take like a screenshot of it, and I'll take it into like Photoshop or something like that. And I'll swap out whatever image I think I'm going to use for a podcast, like something I'm playing around with. And I'll swap it out for one of those images, and I'll just kind of look at the whole picture and see which of those images stands out. And if it's not my podcast standing out, then it's not good enough, right? So that could be the color, that could be the text, that could be the font size, but you don't want to put too much stuff up there. And I do think too, it needs to somehow explain what your show is about, not with words, but with images, right? So, I mean, that is your advertising for your podcast. We scroll through this stuff all the time. And if it's not interesting enough, they're never going to click on it. Even if it's free, they won't even click on it. There's too many out there. I think there's like 5 million podcasts out there now. That exploded. At least. Yeah. You know, I'm not saying they're all producing content all the time, but it doesn't matter because it's still showing up, right? So, you know, you're still there with all these other shows and you're still essentially kind of competing, kind of not competing, but you're competing for someone to click for sure. Right? Yeah. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay. You're based in the American market.
Yes.
Which is maybe the most advanced one. So can you, and usually what happens in the United States and what happens in California, then it later happens in the rest of the world.
A lot of times, yeah.
Can you tell me what's trendy in doing a podcast? Short episodes, longer episodes, interviews, or some kind of personal stories, like one single player talking. What actually in terms of how long an episode should be, and in terms of what type of episode you are doing, interviews or something else?
Yeah.
What's trendy now?
So this changed quite a bit after the lockdowns and COVID and stuff, because what we were finding prior to that is that the longer form content that would kind of take people on their drive to work and maybe even back, that is what people just, we're creatures of habit, right? We're like, oh, we'll listen to the podcast on the way, or, we're working out for an hour, so it fits my little workout schedule or whatever. I do think we're seeing a lot more shorter form podcasting since COVID, because a lot more people, some people are going back to work, but you still have a lot of people like listening in their homes. So it doesn't fit that exact format that it did before. We're seeing a lot more variety. What's really popular content wise now seems to be the dramas. Back in the day, we hear these stories, maybe it was in other places in the world, but like the early radio days, right? Where you've got sound effects and you still have interviews, but it's all, it's all scripted kind of. I mean, you might interview someone, but then, it's kind of like you're putting together a news story because it's still scripted. You're still kind of writing to the sound bites and whatever. The true crime genre has exploded here in the US. I'm not a huge fan of true crime, but there's a lot of people that are, but it still follows that storyline. It's like they're telling a story and then this happened and then this person had a court case, and it is just, it's hooking people, but it's using, I'm seeing a lot of creativity using sound effects, using music. And I'm really grateful that the industry has come a long way with music, because originally we didn't have music for our podcasts. The only options were to somehow, get the rights to it, but you were using the same methods that you do it for a TV show or something like that. I mean, there was nothing just for podcasts, but the space has come really far with that. So now we've got plenty of options. It's all very economical. You can have amazing music in your podcast. A lot of those different resources too also include sound effects. So if you are interested in doing something more scripted like that, it's easier now than ever to be able to do it. You just got to use your storytelling skills. I'm feeling a lot of people here probably do have those skills. So that might be a popular thing. I don't think that the interview format is ever going to go away. It's usually one of the easiest to do, right? It's harder to do like a monologue kind of podcast because it's just you. I do that with, I host a podcast called Podcast Your Business, where I tell people about how to podcast specifically for your business. So if you create a podcast for your business, what do you need to consider? And we talk about a lot of stuff that would just be helpful for podcasters in general, but that is a monologue podcast. And I can tell you, it is definitely more of a challenge, you're talking to your audience, but you're kind of talking to yourself for 25 or whatever minutes. But you could do shorter form too. I'm seeing more 10 minutes, 15 minutes, things like that. I think, when people ask me the question of how long should your podcast be, I give them an answer that they probably don't want to hear, but it's true. It's exactly, the length that it's interesting and that people listen to it and not a second further. So don't try to fill a 30-minute episode if the only good content you have is 15 minutes. Cut it off at 15 minutes. Likewise, there are, they're not a lot, but there are a handful of podcasts that are 3 hours or longer, and they only release episodes every month, every 2 months, every quarter, but they're amazing, right? So I think that's one of the things I love about this space is that it doesn't follow that same format that radio and TV does. You can have a 5-minute podcast, and there are 5-minute such and such. I've seen them all the time. Or you can have a 3-hour-long podcast. But I still think the majority of us are falling in with that maybe 30 minutes is what I'm seeing a lot of. I'm seeing a lot of 30-minute weekly shows, and most of those are interview formats. And the nice thing about doing an interview show is that, again, you've got that person to bounce things off of. So it doesn't usually feel that long unless you've got a really bad guest, and then it feels like you're pulling teeth sometimes. But for the most part, the flow is better. So you're maybe doing some research on the person you're interviewing and you've got your questions. Okay. But it's not a lot of, just you figuring out how to fill the space or whatever. So I don't think those are going anywhere. I think we're always going to have those. The nice thing too about those is that in theory, when it's time to release those episodes, you have someone else that might be willing to promote it for you. Right? Because they're on it. Anytime I'm on a podcast and, I always promote it. Always. Now, not everybody does. Sometimes people get frustrated because they have, some comedian on or some celebrity or something like that, and then they don't promote it. It doesn't always work. Okay. But for the most part, it, can definitely help you with promotion as well. So that's kind of what we're seeing. I mean, it really is all over the map. But what's most important is the content has to be strong. So don't feel like you have to fill a certain amount of time. Do what is good. Make sure your content is spot on. Make sure you're talking to the right people. Don't waste people's time. There are so many options out there now, content options for people to consume content, right? We've got everything on demand they could possibly want and 20 million channels and whatever. So when you find your audience, treat them well. Don't lose them. Okay. Your audience is so important. So keep the content spot on and true to whatever your content is about.
Okay. And you said that you can share something about monetization.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
At the beginning, yes, we started with it, but firstly, you said that it's important to start even from scratch. I mean, when you start thinking about having a podcast, to have in mind that you need to somehow end up with monetization.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about it, and also what type of monetization you use, like having a Patreon or some other type of give me some money thing, or just looking for particular sponsorships or something?
Yeah. So I'll talk about the first part first, which is, really thinking, even now, if your show is not ready for monetization, that's okay. And there are some podcasts that will never be monetized, either because the host doesn't want to.
Like mine.
Maybe, but some people choose that's just not what they want to do. You can podcast without monetizing, obviously, right? There's a lot of podcasters that are doing that. So that's one option. Okay. But if you are serious about monetization, I do think it will help you, not that this is the only route to go, but it will help you if you start to think about that from the very beginning. And the reason I say that is because there are probably certain things you would change about your show if you thought, or if you were really planning on having advertisers. Sometimes people go into doing a show and, they're just doing a show for fun or whatever, and then it catches an audience, and then they're like, oh, well, now we can monetize this, but the formatting is all wrong and the content is a mess. And, there can be a lot of issues. You may have more of a show where there's, I don't know, a lot of cussing, a lot of, politics or something like that. That's not something that's easily sponsored, to be honest. Really depends. So you have to kind of think about this stuff in advance. But one of the biggest things that I have people focus on is the overall format. When you think about the format for your show, I want to talk a little bit about ads. Okay. And you can ads can be different things. Ads can be a promo that you want to put in your show to promote something about your show. You started a new Facebook page, or, I don't know, your show is traveling. You're going to be in this city, or whatever the case may be. So you can include promos in your show. You can include ads, which are more, focused on an external product or service that you're partnering with someone for. You can also include affiliates partnerships, if that's something that you guys, really like and you want to do that. But with all of those, you have to have the space in the show in order to be able to have those ads. One of the things I talk about a lot for the podcast on our network, and I put out a lot of content about this, is dynamic ad insertion. Okay, this is a way to insert these types of ads or promos into your show. The other option is just saying it into your show as you're recording it. Okay. But dynamic ad insertion uses technology to be able to insert these ads into your show, and you can also pull them out whenever you want. You can also put limitations on it, like, oh, I only want this ad to be heard for people in this location. Right. So if you are traveling somewhere and you're trying to promote, hey, we're going to be in this city on this date, you can have that ad just go out to people in that zip code or that area. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this. And advertisers really like this too, because ads only play, like their ad only plays if people listen long enough in the show to hear it. So when you're giving a breakdown to an advertiser of how many people actually heard it, they really did hear it. If you don't have those same numbers, if you're just editing the ad into your show, you don't know if the person actually listened long enough to hear the ad. You just know that they started the episode and they could have listened to it, but it's not specific. So there's a lot of advertisers that's not good enough for them. I mean, why would you want to pay for a podcast to run an ad if you're not really sure if the ad actually, someone listened long enough to hear the ad? So I got a lot of information that kind of breaks down this kind of stuff, but that's the first thing that you have to think about. Dynamic ad insertion is only available on certain podcast host providers. So, that's another question to think about as you're starting your show. Where do you want to host your show? Maybe you want to start with a podcast host provider that allows this dynamic ad insertion, that has this capability. Even if you don't run ads in the very beginning, you're still with the right person that can set you up when it's time. The other option would be to start with another podcast host provider and then switch over, which a lot of people do. There's nothing wrong with that. You can transfer podcast host providers. But what I did with my parenting shows is I knew about this dynamic ad insertion. I wasn't with a podcast host provider at the time that really specialized in that. So what I did is I still formatted all my shows. And what I mean by formatted, I'm thinking about, okay, when can I take a commercial break? And is that a natural place to take a commercial break? And also the editing of this, because with a dynamic, ad, you don't, let's say it's a 30-second ad spot. You don't just leave 30 seconds of blank nothingness in your podcast episode, okay? Because we're using technology here. So what you do is you maybe leave a half a second of nothing, but then that time code, okay? And then you do that for however many spots you have in your show. And then when you're uploading your episode to your podcast host provider, you tell them the time codes of where those commercial spots could hit. And then later on, when you have someone that is, interested in sponsoring or something you want to promote, then you use that same technology and you say, okay, and all, this is one of the things I love about it. In all of my episodes, in that first ad marker spot, that's what it's called. When you put those little markers in, it's an ad marker. In that spot, I want to run this promo. So for example, when we run a new dynamic ad for podcasts on our network, it not only goes out on the most recent episode, it goes out on every single episode, right? So it doesn't matter if someone is listening to the very first episode I ever created for that podcast or the one I just released last week, right? So you're actually, when you have a library of content like that, you can actually make a lot more money. I tell the story for people when I talk about dynamic ads. I tell the story of how I 10x my podcast revenue overnight and how I was able to do that. And I did that by switching and doing dynamic ads, because I wasn't just dealing with my most recent episode, right? I didn't just record an ad for my most recent episode and put it out there for the advertiser. I recorded an ad and put it in all 100+ episodes. So let's say a podcast was getting, 10,000 downloads for the month, for that show, because that's how long it ran, and it ran on all those episodes. Then I could sell that to the advertiser, 10,000 downloads. Maybe my most recent episode only got 1,000 downloads. So that would be 10xing your podcast revenue. So it's huge. Dynamic ad insertion, I talk about it a lot. In fact, I have an entire free course that goes over all this stuff and how to, put the ad markers in your show and how to do all that. And I'm a huge advocate for it. It's easier to do that kind of stuff in the very beginning with your podcast. However, one of the things that my network does is we do help. If we decide we want to work with a show, we can go back and retrofit all of their episodes for dynamic ads. It's just not as clean, right? Because we're not going in there and actually editing the file. We're just going in there and trying to find spots where a break could make sense. But it's always best, when you're looking at the format of your show, if you know when your commercials are going to be, then you can kind of lead into it like, oh, we'll be right back. And maybe you have a little music that trails out, or, it just sounds more natural. So that's why I say it's important to, if you really want to go down that path, then I really think dynamic ad insertion is the best. There's a bunch of content online that you can figure out, and learn more about that. But if you don't do it in the beginning, then you're going to be playing catch up later on.
So which platforms are supported? Is Spotify supported or? Yeah,
there's a few. The one that our podcast network uses is called Megaphone, and I think it's megaphone.fm if you look it up. Let's see, there's more and more that are using dynamic ads now. I think Libsyn, Libsyn, I think that's how you spell it. I think they do dynamic ads. Podbean does dynamic ads. And there might be a couple other ones. Those are some of the big ones.
Yeah, because the idea sounds great. I just learned about it from you and I'm fascinated. The thing is, I'm afraid that these platforms are not really popular here because we're old school. Yeah, we like YouTube, we like Spotify and that sort of stuff. So I want to implement them, but I'm not sure if I start to promote my podcast on this platform that you just said that there will be such a great impact.
Well, now keep in mind, I don't know what's available in all countries, so that's definitely something to look into. But your podcast host provider is really just to give you your RSS feed. It's not the distribution platform, right? Because once you have your RSS feed, which has the content for your podcast in it, that's when you submit that feed to Apple Podcast and Spotify and Google and whatever other apps that you want. So yeah, I'm not sure which podcast host providers are available in the various countries. That's definitely something to look into. But look up, maybe you could Google or look up, dynamic ad insertion and then the name of the country and see what pops up.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you have just a little bit more time, because I know it's already, we are past our due times, but never mind. I have a question about the studio setup, because usually I do video podcasts. So do you think that the studio setup should be more colorful, more bright, or should be more like gray, like your wall behind you? To phrase it other way, should the focus be on the studio and the guests, or only on the guests? That means, should it be more minimalistic, or to be more popping, more bright, more lively? I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, no, I got you. I think your guest needs to be the focus of it. Okay. So the background should be simple. It's not that it can't be bright, but remember that example that I used when I said, I take a screenshot and then I, use the artwork and I see what pops out. You don't want people's eyes to be focused on something other than the guest. Usually, when we talk to people, we're looking in people's eyes. So you want that to still be the focus. And if you've got something very busy or something in the background, I always, when I'm recording for video podcasts, I tell people, I'm like, okay, don't have any writing on your shirts. Try not to have any crazy patterns and things like that, because we want to hear what you're saying. And if our focus is taken away from what you're saying, then that can be a problem. So it's not that bright colors can't work, but if you're more focused on that than the gas, then that's when it's a distraction. Yeah. Yeah. Lighting is super important too. For those of you that are doing video podcasts. So you just got to get your lighting right. A lot of the issues that I see with video podcasts are people don't have a controlled environment to be able to control their lighting. So they're reliant on natural light outside.
Not the best case. Yeah.
It's not the best case, because it's like, oh, now this interview is at nighttime and now I have no light.
What do we do? Yeah.
Yeah. So fortunately, like today, I'm in like a garage type of environment where it's dark anyways. And that's helpful for me, because then I know, listen, I have to supply all of my light. So it doesn't matter if I'm recording at 3 o'clock in the morning or 10 a.m. Doesn't matter. It still works. So that can make and break a video podcast, is your lighting.
Yep. And the camera source, but that's the more expensive stuff. Like it's easier to fix the lighting than to buy new cameras.
Sometimes having better lighting, though, will help with camera issues, right?
Yep.
Cameras can only do so much. The one I'm using today is an external DSLR camera, so I'm not using a webcam. Nice. But it's tricky. It does show, but it's tricky, and then, sometimes the camera doesn't work and you're fidgeting with it. It's just the beauty of technology.
Every time.
Every time you need it, right? Yeah.
I think that we need to finish this extremely interesting conversation. Yes, it was. You're a dynamic person, and it's something that's people can feel it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Not only because I see you, your voice is somehow influencing me. So I'm going to breastfeed or whatever you say there.
Whoa.
Good luck with that one.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting for me.
Wonderful.
To take a little bit of your energy and your advices.
Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you so much. We would actually love to maybe, continue this conversation in some format, because I see how much experience you have, and you can tell us more about audiences and all these challenges that we face as beginners. So that's very, very useful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Do you have just 2 minutes more to stay with me and Sasha, just for a logistic question? Okay. Sure. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.